Namaste, Larissa Crawford, Dishne Kashun. Bonjour, je m'appelle Larissa Crawford. Hello, my name is Larissa Crawford, and I'm the founder and managing director of Future Ancestor Services Incorporated. And I just finished an anti-racism training with a client, and myself and the participants really found that what I'm about to share with you about whiteness and about white fragility is so important to understand right now in terms of critical self-reflection and understanding why you may feel so defensive towards, especially if you are white or white passing or benefit from whiteness, such as myself with lighter skin, to start delving into why maybe you feel so defensive. And then for those who are approaching or experiencing the blowback of white fragility, understanding better where that may be coming from and how you can clarify what you're talking about and your message to address possibly some of the triggers that is not allowing them to really understand what you're saying and the justice that you're trying to bring about. And a lot of that comes from a lack of understanding of where this idea of white and whiteness comes from and how it was used as an economic tool for colonization, for empire expansion. So I'm going to share with you a section of an anti-racism training that we do. So the idea of white and whiteness, I think it's really important to acknowledge and recognize that this is a social, political, and historical construct that has been designed to consolidate power, where those who are white or have lighter skin and who fall within this, the look of European phenotype, benefit from the systems from which white and whiteness has fostered. So if we look at kind of the history, I think it's really important to understand first the history of where this idea of race even comes from. Because racism has not been a part of our entire human history. It has been constructed, and plenty of research has gone into the understanding that race, the idea of race and racism, is a relatively new concept that came alongside the emergence of the transatlantic slave trade. And that this isn't a coincidence that this happened. So if you look at the manual here, when the scientific and intellectual ideals of enlightenment came to dominate the thinking of most Europeans in the 1700s, they exposed a basic contradiction between principle and practice, the enslavement of human beings. So in all of this discussion about freedom, about equality, about relinquishing the classes from monarchy and monarch rule, there was this contradiction because what they were calling for wasn't afforded to this idea of slavery. It wasn't afforded to the people who were slaves. And so they had to find this moral resolution for that contradiction. And despite these ideas, despite Enlightenment ideas of human freedom and equality, especially that inspired the revolutions in the United States and France, the practice of slavery persisted. And so it was around the late 1700s and early 1800s that American and European scientists really tried to explain the contradiction by using race science, which advanced the idea that humankind is divided into separate and unequal races. Because if Europeans were biologically superior, it would rationalize the cruel and inhumane treatment that they afforded to the slaves and the stolen bodies from their indigenous lands. And so that's where you see the emergence of phrenology. So it's a pseudoscience. It's been disproven in so many different ways, which is the study of the skull, shapes as indicator of mental ability. So what they tried to do was justify that specifically people from Africa were less mentally able, were subordinate to the superior European population because of the skulls, because of all of this pseudoscience that really had the intention of explaining why it's okay to have this such a cruel system of slavery. This was also used to justify the genocide and slavery of indigenous peoples as well. So that's really important to understand. There's a huge body of history that goes into the roots of race, and a lot of people aren't aware of that body of research. And so I think that this is just the tip of the iceberg for what we're talking about when we're saying that race is really a constructed phenomena, and that yes, we look different, and yes, we have different noses, different eyes, whatever the case. But in terms of race and our understanding of abilities, mental abilities, and our understanding of subordination and our understanding of supremacy, that is new and that is constructed. And that I think really is really important to understand the economic interests, the colonizing interests in creating this idea of race. So that when we talk about white and race and whiteness, we have to consider this history and how historically rooted it is. Now, because it is historically rooted and its construction is historically rooted, white fragility runs so deep. White fragility is learned, which means it can be unlearned, but it is a learned response. It's a learned reaction to challenges and triggers that bring about a defensive attitude, a defensive reaction. So if we want to try to define white fragility, we can define it as a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive moves. So the moves include the outward display of emotions such as anger, fear, and guilt, and behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and leaving the stress-inducing situation. And by leaving, allowing the issue to fester and not be resolved. And this is a really important idea to unpack. And so in this training, we went through this in quite a bit of detail in terms of what are some causes and some stresses, and then of white fragility, and why white people sometimes face this racial stress. And I want to emphasize that not all white people are going to experience this, but if they aren't experiencing this, that usually means that they have either done that work, have had experience in having conversations about race, or that they've been brought up with exposure to media, to behaviors and attitudes that create a certain degree of comfort around talking about race and privilege. So when we're thinking about what are some causes of white fragility, and this is what I'm talking about in terms of what really helps me in understanding why someone may get super defensive when I start talking about race. It helps me understand maybe what I'm not doing clearly enough, what I'm not saying clearly enough, or what I may be missing, or what I may be triggering. And in understanding what I may be triggering, it helps me with my approach. It may mean that I talk more about about the general taboos about talking about race before bringing up a conversation. Or on the flip side, if I realize that someone's getting super defensive, I talk about how taboos of talking about age is really impeding our ability to talk about ageism in workplaces. And then I bring that to the conversation of race, very similar to how taboos about talking about race in our society right now are hindering our opportunities to identify what's wrong and identifying ways forward and mechanisms to resolve that. So this is a really great list. In terms of critical self-reflection, if you see yourself reflected in a defensive reaction when you are faced with these causes of racial stress, and you see the effect on the aspect of your racial identity, this is where you can start doing some unpacking and unlearning in terms of, why am I so triggered by this? Why do I feel like I need to be defensive? Why do I feel like I need to say sorry to all of my Black friends right now? And in going through and unpacking that for yourself, you're able to be a better ally, and you're better positioned to have conversations about race without making it about you. And one that I can speak to can be this. Let's talk about this one. Racialized people choosing not to protect the racial feelings of white people in regards to race. And so many of my colleagues have faced this, where they've talked about race, they've provided feedback about a race-related, say, policy, or the absence of racial considerations in a public communication. And in bringing that topic up, and then having the comfort to be able to say, this may be a race-related issue, what we may see and what I've experienced is the defensiveness of a white individual to say that, well, that this isn't the place to talk about race, or, well, I'm not being racist, I didn't know, and getting immediately defensive or about what you said, or defensive about why race was even brought up in the first place. And a lot of that ties back to this entitlement of needing to feel comfortable whenever we talk about race. It goes back to the expectation and the need to have their feelings babied as we walk through the step of explaining how, although their intentions may have been good, the impact was harmful, or the impact was inconsiderate of this, this, and this. And so when we start to reflect on that as someone who's talking to someone, and we are then faced with this blow of white fragility, when we can understand that, we can call it out, but we can also change the way that we approach that conversation. And in doing so, explaining what you're doing and explaining that I recognize that you have some discomfort about talking about race, but I also want to acknowledge that that's an expectation that can't be afforded to us, because if we don't talk about race, we suffer the impacts of this, this, and this. And so this is really helpful in both critical self-reflection and understanding, why did I feel like I needed to blow out when someone brought up the idea of race? Is it because I feel entitled to feel comfortable in any conversation about race? And being able to critically self-reflect about that gives you the tools to, again, be a better ally and to move forward and change your behaviors and identify where you need to do some more learning. I have gone through this. I use this list often, and I think it has a lot of power. Now, when we're thinking about white fragility, let's look at it in a historical and then contemporary context. Let's think about this idea, this "okay, Karen" meme. I want to first talk about like the historical roots of using a name like this. So this goes back to the time of of slavery, master slavery. And the example is one of Miss Anne. So instead of Karen, it was Miss Anne. And it was a name Black slaves would use specifically to refer to the white women who wanted to exert power over them, but it was power that they didn't have. And so in terms of this, this idea, it's recognizing that although white women are oppressed by the system of patriarchy and are maybe oppressed as women, which is valid and not what we're trying to refute here. What happens is that with what happened here, and that what continuously happens, is that white women will then, okay, I can't exert power because of my gender, but I can exert power because of my race. And that's what we're seeing, this idea of this name for that specific kind of woman coming out of Black culture, of Black rhetoric. So though the names have changed and have largely been replaced, Becky and Karen, the idea behind the names is still the same. And in an article, actually, that it was a CNN article, and it was exploring like how do Karens actually feel about this? And it was an interesting read, and I'll share all of these citations of which I'm getting this information in the caption. But in CNN, this group of Karens essentially said, this is what they said, there's no real systemic oppression there. It won't prevent you from getting married or getting health care. You're just acting entitled and rude, and that's why you're getting called Karen. And so to recognize that this movement of claiming that Karen is some kind of slur or some kind of oppression is misplaced. And to compare it to the N-word, to compare it to all of these other racial slurs is misinformed. While one of the Karens in the group had said that, although she shares that perspective, she does feel that she does take it personally, a little personally, just because it's her name. And I think that's important to recognize too, is that she is more scared to speak out because of the potential to be called, okay, Karen, like, bye. And while that's valid, that doesn't come up to the same level of systemic oppression. And when we think about like where this idea of Karen comes from, I think it's really important to acknowledge, and this idea of white women using this power of white supremacy in absence of their power afforded to them by their gender, is this Twitter thread that I really enjoyed by Silver and Dark on Twitter. And again, this will be included in the citations. But essentially what they say is this, and I will read it out loud. As white women, we are accustomed to being oppressed under patriarchy. It sucks, and we hate it. That's an immutable fact that is not being disputed. However, as white women, we are not accustomed to being oppressed under white supremacy because we benefit from white supremacy. We benefit in ways we probably don't even notice unless we are specifically looking for them. But historically, white women have been very aware of the benefits of white supremacy. Suffragettes frequently positioned themselves in opposition to Black civil rights to gain leverage. Those suffragettes were the first Karens. And arguably, the Miss Anns were really the first Karens. But let us continue. Karens are that specific kind of white women who appeal to white supremacy to gain power they otherwise lack under patriarchy. There's a reason that the trope involves speaking to the manager. An appeal to the power structure will often result in an outcome favorable to the white woman involved, at the expense of the BIPOC involved. Please understand this context before claiming misogyny when someone calls you Karen. Take a minute to think about what you're leveraging in the situation, whom you're throwing under the bus to gain support, and whose support you're gaining. Now, to give a very concrete example of historic and present day Karens, let's talk about Carolyn Bryant and Amy Cooper. So Carolyn Bryant, it's really important to understand the situation and to understand this history and the lynching and murder of Emmett Till, who was a 14-year-old African-American who was lynched in Mississippi in 1955. And who had been accused of offending a white woman in the family's grocery store. So it's really important to acknowledge that Carolyn was 21 at this time. And she falsely accused this boy of doing things, of whistling and of making physical and verbal advances at her. And I say falsely in that in 2008, she admitted that she had made that part up. But there is nothing that could have taken back what happened next. And that was, I won't go into the details of, I get emotional about this every time. I won't go into the details about what happened to Emmett Till, because it can be triggering for some people, but I really urge you to uh, do your research into how dangerous an action um, being a Karen can be, and how dangerous an action appealing to the privilege and support of white supremacy could be on absolutely innocent lives, such as that of Emmett Till. And what Carolyn Bryant did provides a lot of contextualization for why what Amy Cooper tried to do is, and what she did is so dangerous. And that the only reason that this had a happier ending was because of video evidence that started during her threat, that started before we saw even her threat. And so in the instance of Amy Cooper calling 911 on Christian Cooper, a Black man who had simply requested that Amy leash her dog in a park where it required that dogs were leashed, in Central Park. This man took a video that showed Amy Cooper responding to Christian Cooper's response by informing him that she planned to call the police and, quote, tell them there's an African-American man threatening my life, which he promptly did. And I think that this is really important to acknowledge. There are two things in this, many things, but two things that really stand out, is that Amy Cooper is Canadian, and that the racism that she demonstrates is our racism. It's Canada's racism. We educated her, we brought her up. That is Canadian racism in full bloom. The next thing is that she had all the right words, African American, and using what she didn't believe to be racist language. And in doing so, not thinking that she's being racist, because she's not saying the N-word, she's not calling him a thug. She's using the appropriate language. And that too reflects very much a Canadian style of racism, and that if we use the right words, if we say the right things, then how could we ever be racist? And so I think what all of this shows is not only the dangerous power of white supremacy, but how impactful and how dangerous white fragility is. And how important it is to understand white fragility in yourself and in the people that you interact with, because it can literally come down to life or death. And so I'm going to stop there, and I just want to contextualize that this conversation happens in our anti-racism training in the context of talking about privilege and talking about systemic barriers. And while we discuss many different kinds of barriers and discrimination, such as ableism and ageism, this one is extremely pertinent to understand right now, especially as we are advocating for justice that is triggering white fragility around the world. So thank you for taking this little mini session, and I just really thought this was important information to share.